Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the Crab Tribe. And I wanted to start today off by just talking about Solemnity. Solemnity is an enchantment. It does a lot of crazy things in the right deck, and I want to jump in and talk about why I love it. It's in my enchantment deck, which I love to talk about, Amaraf the Lustrous. And kind of funny, I was looking at just backgrounds with Solemnity, and all these religious images started coming up, which hey, I thought was appropriate. First of all, because it's Easter week, Holy Week, and it's a white card, so it's all about life gain, clerics and angels. So you know what, it fits. So I just threw that together. Hope you like it. But let's just jump in and talk about this wonderful card. So I decided to change up the format and just have all my tabs open. And instead of make a PowerPoint with a long process of getting all those images together, I'll just stream my browser. So here is Solemnity. It is a $5 little enchantment here that says players cannot get counters, and counters cannot be put on artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or lands. So it does not remove existing counters, but it prevents new ones from being put on all these permanents and players. So here's kind of my outline for today. We talked about the definition, and here's just some general good things about the card. It's an anti-poison card. So poison is a counter that players get from infect, from toxic, or even poisonous. And if you have 10 or more poison counters, you lose the game. So you can never get poison counters with Solemnity, so that is just one of the few ways to slow down those type of decks. Cumulative Upkeep. Cumulative Upkeep is an old mechanic that says you have to pay an increasing cost. Every upkeep you put an age counter, and then you pay the cost equal to the age counters. But because those are counters, Solemnity will negate that. So a popular card for this is Mystic Remora. It says when an opponent plays a spell, or non-creature spell, I believe, unless they pay 4, you may draw a card. But it has a cumulative upkeep of 1, so you pay 1, then 2, then 3. So it's pretty good because it stays in the battlefield for a few turns and gets you a lot of cards. But you can make it even better here with Solemnity. Most of the cumulative upkeep cards are pretty bad, but this is just one way to make some use out of them. And then Persist, and I guess Undying, but mostly Persist here. Persist is a triggered ability where it says if a creature would die, it is returned to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter. So sometimes that kills the creature if it has if it would have less than 1 toughness. And kind of creates a loop there because Solemnity will say that it doesn't come to the battlefield with a negative counter. So it would still die. It just won't get the triggered ability of now having the negative counter. Um, so that's just one way you can kind of have infinite death triggers going on. So I did want to note that it does not affect Planeswalkers or the new battle cards, because Planeswalkers obviously have the loyalty abilities and from loyalty counters, and battles have these defense counters. I'll show you here. What we can do, though, is you can very quickly make them enchantments, or you can make them artifacts with either of these cards, Enchanted Evening or Mycosif Lattice. So it's kind of a hard counter for Planeswalker decks because they would enter with 0 loyalty counters and immediately be destroyed. And battles is a new mechanic here. It enters the battlefield under opponent's control, and then you get the triggered ability here. So, for example, here, this one, you get a Kraken. Okay, you pay 3, get a 1/1. Whoop-de-doo. And then you have to defeat it. So you or someone else has to bring it to 0, and then it's transformed. But if it somehow was an enchantment or an artifact, it's just immediately transformed because it has no counters. And then it's a 3/3 with this awesome Convoke passive, and then untap, basic like a Vigilance. This is one of my favorite ones so far that's been spoiled. So yeah, that's how I think it would work. It's kind of a jank thing that's possible, so I just thought I would mention that. But the main part of this video is discussing certain combos we can do with Solemnity. So Solemnity has thousands of combos because it prevents counters, so it prevents some triggers, and you can take advantage of that. And I just chose 10 cards. These two I kind of combined because they're very similar. And it's not exactly ranked, but I would say the last two are very, very good. But let's just jump right into it. First of all, I did want to mention Divine Intervention, and was one card I kind of thought of that I might include in this list. Because if you just read the printed version here, so it enters with 2 intervention counters, and then on your next upkeep, you remove a counter. And then if there are no intervention counters on it, the game is a draw. So if you just read that last sentence, you would think that the game would instantly end in a draw. But the Oracle text says when you remove the last intervention counter. So you can't remove counters that aren't there. So with Solemnity, this actually does nothing. So just keep that in mind if something is worded this way. If something requires you to remove counters as a triggered ability, then you can't remove something that's not there. So I thought that'd be pretty cool, but it doesn't work that way. Anyway, first card on the list is 9 Lives. 9 Lives is thematic. It's all about these cats because, cats have 9 lives, I guess. So if a source would deal damage to you, prevent that damage. So it doesn't matter how much damage it is. If someone hit you for 1 damage or 15 damage, all the damage is prevented. And then for each source of it, you get an incarnation counter. And then when there are 9 or more incarnation counters, you exile this card. And then when it leaves the battlefield, which it would when it's exiled, you lose the game. So it's hexproof, so it's a little harder for your opponent to remove it normally. But, it gives you 9 basically chances to win the game, or kind of clear your opponent's board. By itself, it's okay. In a commander game, you might not last too long because you have 3 players, not just 1. But we can make it good because with Solemnity, we will never get an incarnation counter, so we can take as much damage as we want, and it doesn't matter. However, you still have the last line of text here. So if your opponent was to somehow sweep the board of enchantments, I believe if it leaves the battlefield at the same time as Solemnity, it still sees that effect and you lose the game. And also, your opponent can remove Solemnity first and then remove 9 lives with a sweeper. So it's okay. It's not the best for what it does with Solemnity, but it's easy to pull off because it's only 2 cards. So that's 9 lives. And then we have the Chronozoa. So this is another type of counter, is Vanishing. Vanishing is it's an ability where it enters the battlefield with time counters on it equal to the Vanishing. And then on each of your upkeeps, you remove 1 time counter, and then when the last one is removed, this creature is sacrificed. So in theory, this is a 4-cost 3/3 flyer that only survives for 3 turns. But the good thing is the last line of text here, if this would die, if it had no time counters on it, you create 2 copies of it. So actually, I did want to mention time counters are also on suspend cards, but suspend cards are suspended in exile. So it doesn't work like that with Solemnity because they're not in the same zone. But anyway, for Vanishing, it does work. So this enters the battlefield, and it has no time counters on it because Solemnity cancels them out, prevents them, and and now if you can just kill it in combat, or if you were to have a sack outlet going, one of the altars or something, and you were to just kill 1, you get 2, and then you kill that one, you get 2, and you could just easily have infinite little viruses and infect everyone with your board of flyers. Infinite death triggers is pretty good. And I imagine you can win the game right there, so that's pretty good. So that's Chronozoa. And then the Phyrexian Unlife is another one of the protection cards. It says you do not lose the game for having 0 or less life. So you can go below 0 life. You can still lose the game from having, being milled out, or different ways like that. But if you would have 0 or less life, all damage is dealt to you as though it were infect. So let's say if you took, if you were at 5 life and you took 10 damage, anything less than 0 is counted as infect. So at that point you would have 5 poison counters. But now if we have Solemnity, we do not get poison counters, so we can just go negative life as long as we need. Doesn't really matter. I guess if Solemnity is removed and then you take damage, then eventually you'll lose. So it just prevents it for as long as you can protect either of those pieces. Something to note here: you cannot pay life you do not have. So you can't use Yawgmoth, Thrawn Physician, or any of those demons that let you pay life if you're at 0 or below, because you don't have life you can't pay. So I did want to mention there is a good card that you should probably have if you're running this. The Sterling Groove gives all of your enchantments Shroud. So Shroud is similar to Hexproof, and it'll just keep you alive a little bit longer with this card. And the idea is just to delay the game so you can win another way, I guess. Oop, spoiled that. Next card is the Luminous Broodmoth. I think this is kind of the first complicated one because it is a creature that is flying, and it has the static ability here that whenever a triggered ability, whenever a creature you control without flying dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a flying counter, and the keyword there is counter. So it doesn't really seem to make sense to me, but because it's all one sentence, so because the creature coming back to the battlefield doesn't get a flying counter, it does not mean that the whole thing is canceled out. So there's a def trigger, and then there is an ETB trigger for the counter. So if you have a creature that doesn't fly, you can go ahead and kill it somehow, and then it comes back without a flying counter because it can't get it with Solemnity. And then you can just if you have an altar or a sack outlet, you can do that forever. So it's another way of infinite def triggers and enter the battlefield triggers. And if you want to not have a sack outlet, you want a way to do that a little quicker, you can just get one of these. There's a lot of creatures like this that have an X value that determines the power toughness. And if you were to pay 0, it enters the battlefield as a 0/0, and then it immediately dies because it's a state-based action of having 0 toughness. And then the Broodmoth returns it to the battlefields. However, it doesn't have the flying counter, and it also still has the 0 toughness. So it just dies again and again and again and again. It creates an infinite loop of death. Wow, infinite loop of death. And it sounds good, but that actually ends the game in a tie, unless you have like a death trigger that drains someone, one of those vampire cards, or some other way that wins the game like that, or you can remove one of these pieces instantly. So yeah, that's just another way to make this card better. Just have one of those X cost cards that die immediately. So that's the Broodmoth. And next is the Decree of Silence. Decree of Silence is an 8-cost enchantment. And it says that whenever an opponent casts a spell, counter that spell and put a depletion counter on the Decree of Silence. And then if there are 3 or more depletion counters on the Decree of Silence, sacrifice it. And then I guess if you really want to, you can pay 6 and cycle it to counter something. I mean, a 6-cost counter is awful. And really an 8-cost counter the next 3 spells is pretty bad, because at that cost, you might as well have three separate counter spells. The thing that makes it also bad is that you don't have the option of countering it. So it's just like I know my opponent has a better spell in his hand, and I don't want to counter this stupid card, but I don't have a choice. It's countered, and I waste the depletion counter on it. Um, so by itself, this card is okay. Um, but I think the reason it's somewhat expensive is because of Solemnity. Because if we can take away this text here, just basically ignore all of this, because none of this happens. It just says whenever an opponent casts a spell, counter it. And that's all we need to know. We never get a depletion counter, so it's almost like a win the game if you have a better board state. And that's pretty fair, I think, for 8 plus the 3 over here. If you're paying 11 mana, you better win the game right away, so this is a good way to do it. And that's the Decree of Science. The next one is the Elephant Grass. Elephant Grass is one of those cumulative upkeep cards I mentioned, and the rules for that are right here. Like I said, at the beginning of your upkeep, you put an age counter, and then you sacrifice it unless you choose to pay the cost equal to the age counters. So in this case, it's 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, increasing like that. But, I mean, as a 1-drop, it's pretty strong for what it does. Black creatures can't attack you. And then non-black creatures got to pay 2 to attack you for each one. So even though it's not going to stay on the battlefield forever, maybe it stays on the battlefield for 3 or 4 turns, and you can play it pretty early and have mana to continuously leave on the battlefield. It's pretty good by itself. Not the best for what it does. You might as well just, I guess, play Propaganda or Ghostly Prison. But if you want to make it really awesome, just play Solemnity, and all of these age counters we never get to put on the Elephant Grass, and therefore we never have to pay this cumulative cost, and black creatures can never attack us. And if you wanted to make this pretty good, even better, I would say, just include the card Darkest Hour, because Darkest Hour just makes everything black. And that's part of some other combos. But in this case, just nothing can attack you because everything is black. I guess if you really wanted to and you had the money, you could also put Painter's Servant in there. But yeah, that's Elephant Grass. Strong defense. It's the best mana value for what it does with Solemnity. So top tier, very good. And then we have the Glacial Chasm. Glacial Chasm has a steep drawback, so it's kind of only good in the right type of deck, I would say. And it's a land slot, so you don't have to worry about taking up a spell slot. So that's something to consider. But it has a cumulative upkeep of 2 life, so you pay 2, and then 4, and then 6, and then 8, and eventually you run out of life. But while it is on the battlefield, creatures you control cannot attack. But all damage dealt to you is reduced to 0. Just prevent all of it. And then when it ETBs, you gotta sacrifice a land. So some drawback, but if you are in a land deck, a land theme deck, land matters, you're gonna be able to play a land from the graveyard more than likely. So this part doesn't matter. And it doesn't produce mana by itself, but that's okay because you might have like Yawgmoth Cradle of Growth, or even the Yawgmoth Tomb, so you can make it produce mana. And this drawback, I mean, yeah, creatures can't attack you, or creatures you control cannot attack. More than likely, you're playing this in a combo deck where you're not really focused on dealing damage and attacking, so that is not really an issue, I think. I have this in my enchantment deck, and it does wonders because with Solemnity, I never have to pay that, and very similar to Elephant Grass, except it's a land. Something to note, though, is actually your opponent's creatures can still attack you. They just don't do damage on the damage step. So if they have any attack triggers, those still trigger. But yeah, generally this is pretty good in the right deck with Solemnity. And then we have the Delaying Shields. Kind of similar to 9 Lives, but works a little differently. So if a damage would be dealt to you, you put that many delay counters on the Delaying Shield instead. So if you are dealt 5 damage from anything, well, you get 5 delay counters, right? And then on your next upkeep, I guess that's why it's called delay counter or delay shield, because on your upkeep, you remove all of those delay counters, and then for each one removed, you lose a life or you pay 2 mana, white and generic. So let's say it was 5. You can either pay that 5 life, so you take it regardless, or you pay 5 times 2, 10 mana. So that's a pretty steep cost. It doesn't leave you with a lot of mana for that turn to work with. So it's okay. But obviously with Solemnity, we never get those delay counters, and we just can take as much damage as we want, and it doesn't matter. So yeah, that's Delaying Shields. Very similar though is the Force Bubble. It looks pretty cool art, by the way. I like that one. If damage would be dealt to you, put that many depletion counters on the Force Bubble instead. When there are 4 or more depletion counters on the Force Bubble, sacrifice it. So I think this one is kind of worse because someone just does the 5 damage, like my last example, and it's just immediately sacrificed. I mean, you still prevent the damage, but it's like, okay, I prevent 5 damage for 4 mana. Not really. I'd rather just take the 5 damage more than likely and use this mana for something else. And then all those counters are removed, so you can do it every turn. But yeah, as long as someone has a big creature, it doesn't really matter. And that's why we need to make use of it with Solemnity and just forget about this depletion counter nonsense. And we can just take as much damage as we want, and it's just all going to be negated. Yep, so these both are 4 costs, and they do something similar, so I put them kind of in one category. Yep, that's the Force Bubble. And then another pretty popular card in the land archetype here, Dark Depths. You might have heard of it. It enters the battlefield with 10 ice counters on it. You can pay 3 to remove 1 ice counter. So to remove all of them, you have to pay a total of 30 mana. And almost no one does that. That's ridiculous. Who has time for that? But if you happen to do that, you get a 2020 creature named Merit Lodge, who is flying and indestructible. So Solemnity is out. It enters the battlefield with 0 ice counters, and you get the triggered ability right away. I guess kind of the balance though is that Merit Lodge as a named creature is legendary. So if you want to make this even better, I would put out like the Mirror Box, something to get rid of the legend rule. And that way you can play Dark Depths from the graveyard and do it over and over again with Crucible Worlds. And then you just have a lot of mirror lodges. And I think is interesting here is what did I do here? Oops. This is a land, so you could have this in your opening hand, and then you could have Solemnity also in your opening hand, and potentially you could play this combo turn 2 or even turn 1, and then you have a 2020 creature very early in the game, and then I mean it's almost GG. Your opponents will be very salty. I mean, if you play it, if you don't have the right board state, you might be the target for a little bit. But yeah, I mean, Dark Depths with Solemnity, it's a top tier combo for sure. Have that in the deck, and since it is a land, you can put it in any color scheme that happens to use white. So yeah. And lastly, I have the Celestial Convergence, and I have this one as the last one because I mean, you just win the game. I mean, anything that says you win the game and it's very hard to get rid of, then that's pretty good. So it's 4 cost, and then you have Solemnity, which is 3 cost. So altogether 7 cost. It enters the battlefield with 7 omen counters. Well, just ignore this line because it's going to enter the battlefield with 0 omen counters. And it says, at the beginning of your upkeep, remove an omen counter from the Celestial Convergence. If there are no omen counters on Celestial Convergence, the player with the highest life total wins the game. If 2 or more are tied, it is a draw instead. Um, so this is kind of like a tricky part of the wording, but because it says at the beginning of your upkeep, all of this triggers at the upkeep. It checks the counters on the upkeep, so you don't actually win right away. You do have to wait a turn. Um, but yeah, if this has Shroud, or it has, you just really make sure everyone's tapped out and they have no way to remove this. Then you're almost guaranteed to win the game if you're white, because I'm just assuming that you're mono white, you're in a life gain deck, and a life matters. So I mean, it's the best because you win the game. Um, so yeah, that is basically all of the cards that I want to talk about. Like I said, there's thousands of different possibilities. I chose these because they have the least amount of cards. These are either Solemnity in one other card or 2 other cards, and it doesn't really involve a lot of mana. Um, and just generally, these are good things to do. So I would love to hear your thoughts, and what are your favorite combos with Solemnity? And just what am I doing good here? Do you like this format of just streaming the browser? Yeah. So that's about all I have for today, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the week, and have a good one.